Today I'm going back to basics because I received a question about shutter speeds. Why would you choose to speed up or slow it down? I'm going to talk all about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you know what to do. You just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit the form on that site. I just might pick your question to answer here on a future show. Also, don't forget to check out my Shoot from the Pit live concert photography workshops. I'm holding them around the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Europe throughout this year. What you'll do is you join me backstage at a real concert where I'll teach you everything about photographing concerts, sports, and really action of any kind. And then you get to shoot the entire show in an arena or a stadium that very night. Just go to shootfromthepit.com for more info and to sign up today. Hope to see you out on the road. Okay, today's question was sent in by Frederick T, and he wants to know, is there a benefit to using slower shutter speeds? And is there a negative effect from using very high shutter speeds? Thanks, Frederick, for sending that in. I know that people tune into Adorama TV at various stages of their photographic journey. So what I want to do in this video is go over the basics of shutter speed and then talk about why you might decide to use certain shutter speeds and get the shots you want. And let's start out with, what is shutter speed? Well, if you're using a digital camera, then the camera body has a digital chip in it that's sensitive to light. When light comes through the lens, it hits that sensor where it's captured and recorded. Now, if you're using a DSLR, there's a thin metal curtain in front of that sensor that blocks all light from hitting it. And when you go ahead and take a picture, that curtain slides out of the way and allows light to hit the sensor. Then there's a second curtain that comes down to cover the sensor again, ending your exposure, and your picture is done. If you're using a mirrorless camera, you might be using an electronic shutter, which actually doesn't have a moving mechanical shutter curtain. I recently did a video about the differences between electronic and mechanical shutters, and I'll put a link to that in the description down below if you want to get more into the differences there. However, whichever type of shutter that you're using, shutter speed does the same exact thing. The shutter speed setting tells your camera how long you want your sensor, or your film, if you're shooting film, to be exposed to light. Now, shutter speed is part of the exposure triangle, which are the three settings that determine how light or how dark your images are. The longer your sensor is exposed, the brighter your image. Light is data for the sensor, so if your shutter speed is very slow, more light is going to hit that sensor and your image is going to get brighter. If the shutter speed is very fast, then it sees and collects less light and your image is going to be darker. Now, the other two settings in the exposure triangle are aperture and ISO, but I'm just really going to focus on shutter speed for this particular video. So every time you take a picture, there has to be a shutter speed set so that your camera knows how long to expose that sensor. Now, if you're shooting full manual exposure, which you probably know I highly recommend, then you're going to set that exact amount of time on your camera. There are some auto modes that are going to allow the camera to pick your shutter speed for you, but as I said, I usually recommend shooting in manual because different speeds actually change the way your pictures look, which I'm going to get into in a minute. Now, to set your shutter speed, you're going to look for the setting on your camera that has numbers like 60, 125, 250, 500, and on in both directions. Now, these numbers are time values, and the higher numbers are faster shutter speeds. That might seem backwards at first, but that's because it's actually the denominator of a fraction and not the numerator. So 60 is actually 1 over 60, or a 60th of a second. 1,000 is 1 over 1,000, or 1/1000th of a second. And 1 is just 1 over 1, which is 1 whole second. So 1,000th of a second is very fast, or a short shutter speed, while 1 second is very slow, giving you a much longer shutter speed. Now, we measure these things in single stop increments, one stop at a time, and one stop is roughly double or half the number next to it. So 60 to 125, for example, is one stop. 125 to 250, also one stop. If you go from 60 all the way to 250, that's 2 stops. Now, most cameras are preset for you to adjust your shutter speed in third stop increments. So if you're at 500th of a second, you can then go a third stop faster to 640, and then another third to 800, and finally a third to 1/1000th. That's going to give you more control than only being able to adjust one full stop at a time. All cameras also have a minimum and a maximum shutter speed. The most common range is from 1/8000th of a second on the fast end, all the way down to 30 long seconds on the slow end. Okay, so knowing all that, why would you change your shutter speed and what impact does it have on the look of your photos? Well, I already mentioned exposure, and that's definitely a big one. Every change of your shutter speed is going to make your images brighter or darker. Now, there are no finite numbers here because every scene is different. If you're shooting in bright daylight, for example, your image might look perfect at 0.02 of a second, but then indoors in a dark room, the exact same shutter speed would give you a pitch black photo because there's less light in there to capture. So you need to find the shutter speed in addition to the ISO and aperture to get the exposure that you want. But I really want to focus the rest of this video on the other things that are affected by shutter speed. Frederick asked about the benefits and negatives of slow and fast shutter speeds. So let me go through some pros and cons, and I'm going to show you some examples of each one. Let's start out with slow shutter speeds. Now, there's no exact definition of what slow really means in this case, but I would say that a 1/30th of a second or slower, which is those lower numbers, would count as a slow shutter speed. Remember, these can go all the way down to 30 seconds or even longer if you use the bulb mode on your camera, which basically means you hold down the shutter for as long as you want, and your shutter curtain is going to stay open, exposing the shutter that entire time. So what can you do, creatively speaking, with a slow shutter speed? Well, because it allows you to brighten your image, you can capture traditionally dark scenes. When I make a wide shot at a concert to show the entire arena or the stadium, the crowd is usually much darker than the stage. So I'm going to slow down my shutter speed in that case. And this shot is taken at a 60th of a second, and you can see how big the entire crowd is, even though I couldn't see that much light when I was in there in real life. And then this shot was way down at 1/6 of a second. It was dusk and there wasn't much light left in the sky, but the long exposure opened up that sky and brought in some beautiful blue color. Now, another thing you can do with slow shutter speeds is create panning shots. That's when you move your camera with your subject and try to keep them in focus while the background just flies by all blurry. This running photo was shot at an 80th of a second, and then I also shot this go-kart picture at a 60th of a second. It does take some practice to do these well, but when you nail it, it gives your pictures a sense of motion that you just can't get with fast shutter speeds. Here's another picture from that same go-kart day, but it was at 32/100ths of a second and doesn't have any of that motion blur in the background. Now, another thing you can do with long shutter speeds is smooth out the motion of things like moving water. I made this image at Niagara Falls with a fast shutter speed of 12/50th of a second, and you can see all the detail in the water, the specular highlights, and even individual water droplets. But then when I slowed down my shutter speed to a 1/2 a second, this is what it looks like. Because the water is moving so fast, the long exposure has the effect of smoothing out the water, and in my opinion, it looks pretty cool. Now, you can also use those long exposures to change the look of rain. On the Luke Combs tour, we've had more than a few shows where it was just pouring rain. Now, this was at 1/8000th of a second, and the water droplets are frozen into tiny little dots. It almost looks like snow. But when I slowed down my shutter to a 30th of a second, the drops get longer and it really looks like the downpour that it was. And there are a few other things you can do by having your shutter exposed for a longer time. If you're photographing fireworks, for example, leaving your shutter open allows you to have more of the bursts in one photo. This was an 8-second exposure. If you're doing something like light painting, you need the time to be able to light up your subject. This is a 30-second exposure in the middle of the night, and I used a flashlight to add some color on that wooden fence. It's also not uncommon for astrophotographers to use very long exposures. My image of the Milky Way at Yosemite National Park also took a 30-second exposure to get enough light to see the stars. And then I made this shot of the Bow Bridge in Central Park using an infrared filter, which cuts out a lot of the light. I had to expose the sensor for a full 2 minutes to make this picture come out. So those are some of the things that you can actually do with slow shutter speeds. But what's the downside? The biggest issue is motion. Other than when you're doing a panning shot where you actually want to move the camera, you usually want to keep your camera completely still during long exposures. With my wide arena shot, I'm hand holding, but I tried to stabilize myself as best that I could. When I do this, I usually keep my arms in tight to my body, and I'm even going to lean on a wall or something else stationary if possible. And I also shoot bursts of images to increase my chances of getting at least one frame without any blur whatsoever. Now, for those very slow shutter speeds like Niagara Falls or the Bow Bridge or the fireworks, I had to use a tripod. There's really just no other way to handhold it. It's not possible to handhold for that long without everything being blurry. So you just have to use some kind of support, a tripod, put the camera on the ground, something else stationary, a platypod, floor plate, something like that that's going to help you keep the camera completely still. Now, one other potential issue of using long shutter speeds with digital cameras is long exposure noise. It's very common to get some digital noise in the dark areas of your images when you get into shutter speeds over 1 second long. This happens because the sensor is powered on longer and heat builds up on it. More heat produces what's called hot pixels, which could show up as white, red, green, or even blue dots. You could also have some weird color splotches. Now, there are ways to fix this using in-camera long exposure noise reduction, but it doubles your exposure time and can just be a hassle to do. But it's something to be aware of if you're going to shoot those super long exposures. So that's slow shutter speeds, but Frederick also asked about fast shutter speeds. Now, the main benefit of using those is that you can freeze things that are moving. This photo is at 1/100th of a second. That's pretty slow, and you can see that the volleyball is blurry because the moving ball changes position while the sensor is exposed. But then by speeding up my shutter speed to 800th of a second, during the short amount of time that the sensor is exposed, the ball is only in one spot. So that makes it frozen solid in midair. So how fast is fast enough to freeze any kind of action? Well, there's no single answer to that question because it depends what you're photographing. Someone walking down the street leisurely might be frozen at 1/250th of a second, but a sports car flying by would be a blur at that speed. You probably need 2,000, 4,000, or even 8,000 of a second to freeze that. Now remember that changing your shutter speed also affects your exposure, so that leads me to another potential benefit of using a fast shutter speed. Since speeding it up makes your image darker, then you might need to open up your aperture to get enough light in to expose your photo. A wider aperture blurs your background more, and many photographers actually like that look. A smooth, super out of focus background helps your subject to pop off the screen. This portrait is at 8,000th of a second, and my aperture is wide open at 1.4. I was using the 85 f1.4 lens. I would not have been able to get 1.4 if I was using a slower shutter speed. I would have had to close down my aperture more, and I wouldn't have had that nice clean background. So are there any negatives at all of using a fast shutter speed? Well, the main one is simply that you need to have enough light to use it. In a really dark environment, you might have compensated with your aperture and your ISO as much as you possibly can, and you still don't have enough light to get a fast shutter speed and freeze the action. The technical part of photography is always a give and take, so you simply might not have anything to take from when you speed it up and your picture is going to be too dark. The only other issue I can think of has to do with a modern problem that happens when shooting under certain kinds of lighting conditions. LED lights in particular can give you an issue called banding. I'm going to put another link to a more detailed video I did about that down below. It's not a common problem, but if you're having it, the only way to 100% fix it is to slow down your shutter speed. Fast shutter speeds make banding look much worse, so be aware of that. So there you have it. These are all the pros and cons I can think of for using fast or slow shutter speeds. Did I miss anything? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. By the way, most of these are actually creative choices, and neither fast or slow is right or wrong. But taking control of your shutter speed allows you to make your images look how you want, and that's really what it's all about. Take control of your images, make the pictures that you want, don't let the camera decide for you, and you're good to go. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it. Do me a favor, like, subscribe, hit that bell icon for notifications. That really helps out me and the channel. Adorama is not only a fantastic store, but they've been providing free photo education on YouTube for well over a decade now. Hope to see you at one of my live workshops this year, and I'll be back next time with a new question right here on Ask David Bergman.